Welcome to Fireside History, where the past comes to life. If you enjoy this retelling, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to hear more. The Battle of Tsushima, 1905. It began beneath a grey, restless sky. The Sea of Japan heaved gently as a cold mist drifted across the water, a veil of damp secrecy that muffled sound and distorted shape. Somewhere out there, over the curved horizon, two navies steamed toward fate, one proud and defiant, the other exhausted, bruised, and thousands of miles from home. What unfolded over the next 36 hours would shake empires, redefine naval warfare, and set the world on an irreversible path toward the global catastrophes of the 20th century. But it didn't start with guns or flags. It started with hubris and the long, lonely wake of a desperate fleet. In the early months of 1905, the Russo-Japanese War was already well into its second bitter year. On land, Japan had shocked the world. Its armies had seized Port Arthur, bloodied the Russians at Liaoyang and Mukden, and driven the Tsar's forces into retreat. But at sea, it was the Tsar's Baltic Fleet that held the world's gaze, or more precisely, the 2nd Pacific Squadron. Dispatched from the chilly harbours of Lipaia and Kronstadt, this enormous fleet, over 11,000 nautical miles from its destination, was Tsar Nicholas II's last gamble. A colossal attempt to regain initiative in the Far East and shatter Japanese naval dominance. They were late, undertrained, and limping. Commanded by Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, a dour, grim man known as much for his volcanic temper as his operational caution, the Russian fleet was a floating anachronism, a mix of newly built battleships and decrepit ironclads. Half the crew had never fired a shot in anger. Some hadn't even fired a live round in training. And yet they steamed on through Atlantic squalls, African heat, and tropical storms, refueling in uncertain ports, dodging imaginary torpedoes, and losing ships to accidents, breakdowns, and tropical disease. By the time they reached the waters near Korea, they were shadows of themselves. Rusted, soot-streaked, morale sagging. They had sailed halfway around the world, only to sail straight into an ambush. Enter Admiral Tōgō. If Rozhestvensky was stubborn, Tōgō Heihachiro was steel. The Japanese admiral, educated in Britain, shaped by years of quiet study and patient wargaming, had forged a modern navy in the image of the Royal Navy, but with a uniquely Japanese soul. Where the Russians were hesitant, Tōgō was bold. Where they favoured static formations, he favoured fluid manoeuvres. He knew the enemy was coming. He had spent months preparing. And above all, he knew where the killing would happen. Tsushima Strait. The narrow passage between Korea and Japan's southern islands. A natural bottleneck, a perfect killing ground. The Russian fleet could pass either to the east or west of Tsushima. And Tōgō laid his trap accordingly, scouting with fishing boats, dispatching torpedo flotillas, and preparing the main fleet to pounce the moment the Russian smoke appeared on the horizon. It was just after dawn, 27th May, 1905. Mist still hugged the sea, but from a high observation post on Okinoshima Island, a Japanese lookout peered through his telescope and froze. Smoke. Not wisps, plumes, a dark line along the southern horizon. He ran. The signal flag was hoisted. Enemy sighted in square 203. A volley of gunshots cracked into the air, an ancient but effective method of alerting nearby ships. Across the Japanese fleet, engines rumbled to life, boilers hissed, signal flags fluttered. And aboard his flagship Mikasa, Admiral Tōgō calmly donned his ceremonial white gloves. He would wait until the perfect moment to engage, but already history had begun to lean in his favour. Let's pause here and consider the ships themselves. These were not the vessels of Trafalgar, or even the American Civil War. These were steel leviathans, thick-armoured, coal-burning beasts, turrets bristling with heavy guns, 12-inch monsters that could lob shells the weight of a piano across miles of open sea. The Mikasa alone carried 4 12-inch guns and 14 6-inch secondaries. She was fast, manoeuvrable, and professionally crewed. The Russian flagship, Knyaz Suvorov, was brand new, a Borodino-class battleship. Heavily armed and armoured, yes, but her gunnery crews were poorly trained. Her ammunition handling procedures were sloppy. And worse, she was part of a rigid, slow-moving formation steaming in line ahead, perfect for enfilade fire. As the two fleets began to converge, the difference in discipline became stark. The Japanese ships moved like a sword, slicing cleanly. The Russians lurched like a drunk with a sabre. Still, they kept coming. They had no choice. At 1:39 p.m, Admiral Tōgō issued the command. A series of flag hoists snapped into place. The signal read, "The fate of the Empire depends on this battle. Let each man do his utmost." Then, with the precision of a parade drill, the Japanese fleet turned hard to port, executing a bold and dangerous manoeuvre known as crossing the T. It was the naval equivalent of getting a clean, side-on shot at a charging bear, your guns all facing forward while the enemy could only reply with their forward turrets. The Mikasa's forward guns roared, twin blossoms of fire, a sound like thunderclaps torn in half. Black smoke coiled up into the sky. Her opening salvos bracketed the Suvorov. Close. Too close. The rest of the Japanese line followed suit. Shells began to rain down on the Russian van with frightening accuracy. On the Suvorov, shockwaves rocked the deck. Men were thrown from their feet. A shell struck near the bridge, ripping open steel and splintering the conning tower. Blood slicked the floor. Communications broke down. And still, the Russians tried to return fire. Their shells, rushed and ill-aimed, mostly missed. For the next half hour, the Japanese pounded them with deadly rhythm. Not frenzied, not chaotic, methodical, mechanical, like a smith hammering iron. By mid-afternoon, the Russian line was in disarray. The Suvorov was ablaze, her steering compromised. Admiral Rozhestvensky, badly wounded, had to be transferred to a destroyer. Other Russian ships tried to rally, but visibility was failing. Funnels belched thick smoke. Communication flags were hard to see through the haze. The Japanese kept their distance, zigzagging to avoid return fire, striking with impunity. Aboard the cruiser, Aurora, a name that would later become famous in a very different revolution, a young midshipman tried desperately to keep morale up among his gunnery team. He later wrote, "The deck was slick with water and blood. The smell of cordite clung to our lungs. Each blast from the enemy felt like a giant's fist smashing the hull. But we kept loading, kept firing. What else could we do?" By sunset, the sea was littered with flaming wreckage. Masts jutted like broken spears. Lifeboats bobbed amidst the debris. Screams echoed over the waves, barely audible over the crack of gunfire and the low, hollow groan of sinking metal. One Russian battleship, Osliabia, took a hit to her bow and began listing rapidly. Water flooded in. Within minutes, she capsized, dragging hundreds of men with her. A destroyer tried to pull survivors from the oily black waves, but it too came under fire and had to retreat. There was no mercy at Tsushima, no quarter, no pause. As dusk fell, the Japanese unleashed their second weapon, destroyers and torpedo boats. Under cover of darkness, they swarmed the scattered Russian remnants like wolves around a dying stag. Small, fast, hard to hit. They closed in and launched torpedoes from near point-blank range. The Russian crews, weary and demoralized, had little chance to react. Some ships tried evasive maneuvers, others simply prayed. Torpedoes struck home with gut-churning violence, columns of seawater and fire erupting from the hulls. Some ships sank in seconds. Others drifted, burning, until ammunition stores ignited with catastrophic results. One eyewitness described the sight. The darkness was alive with motion, shadows flickering, explosions blooming, the sea glowing orange beneath the stars. It was not a battle, it was butchery. And all the while, the Japanese fleet remained largely untouched. Their coordination, training, and gunnery had turned the battlefield into a shooting gallery. By the end of the first night, the outcome was no longer in doubt. But this was only the first half of the slaughter. As dawn broke on the 28th of May, the shattered remnants of Russia's pride limped through the waves, hunted. Some tried to flee to neutral ports. Some surrendered. Some kept fighting, because to do otherwise was unthinkable. Morning came slowly. The Sea of Japan was strangely calm now, eerily so. Smoke still hung on the water like a funeral shroud, thick and sour with the scent of oil, ash, and something darker, something human. Wreckage drifted silently, splintered timbers, a single boot, a body face down, bobbing gently beside a scorched lifebelt, marked with Cyrillic letters. The sun rose over a killing ground. For Admiral Tōgō, there was no hesitation. While the main Japanese fleet rearmed and regrouped, scouting vessels and destroyers continued the chase. The Russian survivors, scattered and staggering, attempted to flee in every direction. Some headed for neutral ports, hoping for sanctuary. Others simply wandered, directionless, their officers killed or wounded, signals down, steam pressure faltering. The Borodino, once the pride of the Russian line, had vanished beneath the waves. The Suvorov was a floating hulk. She drifted, listing badly, guns silent, lifeboats wrecked. Fires still burned along her decks, and the crew, what was left of them, were barely coherent. Many were wounded. Some had gone blind from smoke and flash burns. Shortly after 7 a.m, Japanese cruisers closed in and finished the job. A spread of shells, precise, almost surgical, tore through the wreck. One penetrated the magazine. The Suvorov disappeared in a single thunderous blast. A pillar of smoke rose into the sky. It hung there for hours. Elsewhere, Russian captains made desperate choices. The Admiral Nakhimov, already taking on water, was scuttled by her crew. Her flag hauled down, her lifeboats lowered into the rising swell. The Vladimir Monomach, an old cruiser long past her prime, had fought hard the night before. Her gunners manning outdated slow-loading cannon with stubborn defiance. But now she was cornered, ammunition low, engines failing. Her captain, realizing escape was impossible, ordered the colours struck. He stood on the bridge as the flag came down. Then he saluted and stepped over the rail into the sea. The Kamchatka, a bumbling auxiliary cruiser, notorious for firing on neutral ships during the voyage east, had somehow survived the opening barrage. She wandered blindly, cut off from the fleet, blundering through the mist and minefields like a drunk in a cathedral. And then she reappeared. Shortly before noon on the second day, the Kamchatka was spotted by Japanese scouts and intercepted by destroyers. A brief exchange followed, confused, frantic, before she disappeared beneath the waves. Some say her final act was to accidentally fire a torpedo at an island. Others claim she never even saw the enemy. History, perhaps mercifully, forgets. It was near the island of Takeshima that the scale of collapse became truly apparent. Japanese cruisers intercepted a cluster of Russian destroyers and support ships attempting to flee. Flags were raised. Instructions given. The Russians signalled compliance. They were done. In the end, the Aurora, Zhemchug, and Oleg, 3 cruisers that had fought with grit and desperation, limped toward Manila, interned in American-held territory. The Almaz made it to Vladivostok, one of the very few that did. The rest were captured, sunk, or surrendered. Admiral Nebogatov, now the de facto Russian commander after Rozhestvensky's capture, signalled his intention to yield. It was a gut-wrenching decision. His ships were intact, but cornered. Ammunition was low. Men were exhausted. He could fight and die, or surrender and live with the shame. He chose the latter. When the white flag was raised, a silence fell over the Japanese line. Not a cheer, not a celebration. Just the low groan of anchors dropping and the slow winding down of the engines. War, after all, had no dignity left in it. Meanwhile, the once proud Admiral Rozhestvensky lay bleeding aboard the destroyer Biedovi. His jaw was shattered, his skull cracked. He drifted in and out of consciousness, barely aware of the surrender his subordinate had just issued in his name. When Japanese vessels intercepted the destroyer, they found the admiral half delirious, wrapped in blood-soaked linen, trying to give orders that no one could follow. He was taken into custody, not as a prisoner of war exactly, but as a symbol. The Russian lion, chained and broken. And yet, to his captor's surprise, the Japanese treated him with dignity. He was taken ashore, given medical attention, and spared the humiliation of public display. One Japanese officer reportedly saluted him with quiet respect before offering him tea. There was honour even here, especially here. When the final tallies were made, the numbers stunned the world. Of the 38 Russian ships that entered the battle, only 3 made it to Vladivostok. Most were destroyed, captured, or interned. Over 4,300 Russian sailors were killed. More than 5,000 were taken prisoner. Japanese losses, just 117 dead. It was one of the most lopsided victories in naval history, not just in scale, but in execution. It wasn't just that Japan had won, it was how they had won. They had destroyed a larger fleet with precision gunnery, coordinated movement and relentless aggression. They had predicted their enemy's approach, prepared their battlefield, and executed their plan to the letter. They didn't just fight the Russians, they dismantled them. Among the wreckage, some voices remained. A young Japanese gunner aboard the cruiser, Nishin later recalled, "When the enemy ship exploded, we cheered, but then I saw the water, the bodies, the faces. I stopped cheering. We had won, yes, but there was no joy in it, only awe." A Russian sailor, taken prisoner after the sinking of the Sisoi Veliki, wrote home from a camp in Nagasaki. The Japanese were not cruel. They were precise. We expected madness, but they gave us water and clean bandages. It is a strange thing to lose with dignity given by your enemy. There were other stories of a Russian ship's dog found barking and half-burned on a drifting spar, taken in by a Japanese officer who carried it back to shore and nursed it until it died. Of a Japanese gun crew who found a Russian lifeboat filled with wounded men and tossed them their own ration tins before sailing away. War, even at its ugliest, leaves room for strange grace. Back in St. Petersburg, the news hit like a hammer. Nicholas II, already reeling from internal unrest, strikes and the bloody suppression of the 1905 revolution, received the news with stunned disbelief. His fleet gone, his prestige shattered. The Russian people, hungry and weary, turned their anger inward. Riots flared. The Tsar's ministers scrambled to contain the outrage. The myth of imperial invincibility had died somewhere off the coast of Korea. The Aurora, one of the few ships that survived, would later become the ceremonial vessel that fired the shot, starting the Bolshevik Revolution in 1917. History has a dark sense of poetry. Tsushima changed everything. For Japan, it was the arrival, not just as a regional power, but a global one. No longer the little island nation. Now the empire of the rising sun had proved itself on the world stage. The victory stunned Europe. A non-Western nation had defeated a major European empire at sea in open battle. It broke colonial assumptions. It rewrote doctrines. Naval powers across the world, Britain, Germany, the United States, tore apart their tactical handbooks. Lessons were learned, formations revised, fire control improved. The age of dreadnoughts was about to dawn, and Tsushima was the warning shot. It also set a dangerous precedent. Japan, emboldened, would walk a path that led eventually to Manchuria, to Nanjing, to Pearl Harbor. Tsushima was not just the climax of a war. It was the ignition of an era. But the real detonation, the one that would shatter the political equilibrium of Europe and Asia, came not from a shell, but from consequence. The Russian Empire cracked. Not overnight, no, but visibly, tangibly. The Battle of Tsushima was more than a military disaster. It was a humiliation on the world stage, one that could not be painted over or drowned in state propaganda. The myth of the invincible Romanov dynasty had ruptured, and that rupture would widen until it consumed the Tsar, his empire, and the old order with it. Within weeks of the battle, emissaries from both Japan and Russia sat down at the negotiating table. They met not in Tokyo, not in Moscow, but in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, on American soil. It was Theodore Roosevelt who brokered the peace. Ever the showman, ever the realist, he seized the moment to elevate America as a diplomatic heavyweight. He would win the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts, but the deeper truth is that both sides were exhausted. Russia, bled and bruised, could not continue. Japan, triumphant, was stretched to its limits. Its treasury emptied by war, its army threadbare, its fleet in need of repair. And yet it had achieved its aim, a negotiated peace that recognized its dominance in Korea and southern Manchuria. Port Arthur was theirs, Sakhalin was split. The bear had been clawed back into the north. The sun had risen over Asia. Across Asia, colonial subjects watched the headlines with wide eyes and clenched fists. In India, whispers stirred. If the Japanese can do it, why not us? In Egypt, in Vietnam, in the Dutch East Indies, the same quiet question took root. It wasn't the immediate cause of revolution, but it planted a seed, the belief that the West was not invulnerable. That power could shift. That dignity could be reclaimed by those long considered beneath the boots of empire. In Europe, navies scrambled to adapt. The British Royal Navy began phasing out older pre-dreadnought classes within months. By 1906, MS dreadnoughts, all big gun, turbine-driven, would render everything else obsolete. And the lesson was clear. Modern naval warfare would no longer be about close quarters or romantic boarding actions. It would be decided by range, fire control, speed, and above all, coordination. Tsushima had rewritten the book. Admiral Zinovy Rozhestvensky, scarred, embittered, and carrying the ghosts of thousands of dead sailors, was eventually repatriated to Russia. He faced court-martial, not for cowardice, no one believed that, but for losing the fleet. He defended himself with quiet fury, He had obeyed orders. He had sailed across the world. He had fought, hopelessly, yes, but he had not fled. He had not abandoned his men. He offered to accept full responsibility, even asking for the death penalty if found guilty, but the court demurred. Public sympathy, oddly, was on his side. The trial became a mirror, reflecting the incompetence not of one man, but of an entire system. A bloated, inflexible, decaying imperial bureaucracy. Rozestvensky was spared. He retired in silence. He died in 1909, never fully escaping the shadow of Tsushima. But in truth, the rot had started far above him. It is easy, too easy, to talk in terms of fleets, squadrons and tonnage, to discuss formations and flags, broadside arcs and fire control solutions. But the Battle of Tsushima was, at its heart, fought by men. Young stokers sweating in hellish engine rooms, shoveling coal by the ton as shells tore through steel decks above. Gunners deafened by the roar of their own weapons, teeth rattling with each recoil, faces blackened with soot and fear. Signalmen scrambling with flags in the wind, knowing a single wrong hoist could doom a ship. Officers clutching their sabres as the conning tower shuddered, bracing themselves for the end. Many died without ever seeing their enemy. Others drowned slowly, clinging to driftwood in the cold, watching the sky as the battle moved on without them. These were not pawns on a map. They were people. For Admiral Tōgō, victory was total. He returned to Tokyo a national hero. Parades, songs, portraits. School children were taught his tactics. His name would forever be linked to Japan's ascent. But even Tōgō, in his quieter moments, saw more than triumph. He had studied at Greenwich. He had walked the halls of Britain's naval academies, seen the complexity of empire, the dangers of pride, and he understood what this victory would do to his nation. "Beware success," he is said to have warned his successors. "Victory breeds arrogance." He was right. Japan, emboldened by Tsushima, would lean into militarism, into conquest, into an imperial dream that decades later would crash into flames at Midway and Hiroshima. But in 1905, all of that was yet to come, and the empire celebrated. Even today, those waters remember. Beneath the waves off the Korean Strait lie the bones of ships and men, rusted hulls, twisted guns, fragments of life once lived in the corridors of floating steel fortresses. Divers speak of eerie silence down there, a boot wedged in a hatchway, a plate marked with a family crest, a shattered periscope gazing eternally into the dark. There are no nationalities at the bottom of the sea, no admirals or midshipmen, only silence, and salt and the strange cold peace that comes after the fire. The Battle of Tsushima was not just the climax of a war. It was a hinge in history, a moment where East overtook West, where steel and coal and human will collided in the Straits of Korea, and empires were reshaped by the result. It marked the twilight of one world and the uneasy birth of another. Because in war, real war, victory is rarely clean, and history is never simple. It is made in the smoke, in the blood, in the silence between salvos, and sometimes in the wreckage left behind. Thank you for listening to Fireside History. If this story moved you, please like, comment and subscribe. Your support helps keep the fire burning.